Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm your daily Deltarune news host Nether, here to bring you another theory type video. This video is going to basically just be me going over everything I find interesting or weird throughout all of Deltarune and try and predict where it will come in, if at all, in future chapters, making some mini theories along the way. This will be a two-part series, as I want this video to come out before the next chapter's release, and at the rate I'm writing it currently, it won't. This video is of course going to be part 1. Before we start, I have a few disclaimers. Firstly, major spoilers for Undertale and Deltarune are ahead. If you haven't played through them, please go do that first, it will be a much better experience. Also, please be nice to your fellow theorists in the comments, it's much more fun to theorize together than to purely criticize other people's ideas, so please keep it civil. Of course, we can't entirely confirm every single thing about future chapters or about the game in general yet, so anything could be possible. All that being said, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and bye bye. Oh boy, this video is going to be very long. I'll actually put the ending time here for those watching this premiere so you can get a good idea. Anyways, let's go ahead and start with the stuff not even inside of Deltarune, but still related to it. Firstly, how is Gaster able to talk in the Twitter pages? I mean, assuming that this is Gaster, which we have a ton of evidence of. I feel like this isn't talked about quite enough. Gaster literally can visit a place only players can visit, which perhaps could link into him being just as powerful as us, which is supported by the fact he helps to bring your soul to the game, create your vessel, and delete save files for Chapter 1. I'm assuming when the next chapter is released we'll get even more dialogue on the Twitter page, but I am curious if he will still communicate with us inside the game, especially since he hasn't said a word post Chapter 1. If the Twitter goes dark again, it could maybe have something to do with that. He may only be able to visit completely dark-filled places, and that's why we don't see him elsewhere. Even in Undertale, assuming that this Gaster is either the same one or follows the same rules, he only shows up in a room surrounded in pitch black. And of course, he also says a lot about darkness all over the place. Makes me wonder if we'll get to see him inside of Deltarune if something like the Legend of the Roaring happens. I'll get to the legend in just a bit, but for now, let's say it hasn't happened yet. Is that the goal of the night, or of Kris? They both very well could know about Gaster, and there's evidence supporting that, and maybe they want something from him. I have a whole theory about Gaster's, and potentially Kris's plans, so I'm not going to go too deep into any of that, but there is some food for thought. I probably won't go too far into most of the theories in this video, just since I don't want to have this video be ridiculously long, but if there's one that interests you, let me know, and maybe I'll make a full video on it if one doesn't exist already. That being said, let's move on to the person in the code. The person in the code is clearly trapped and scared, lost in a foreign place. Whether or not this person is the code itself is kind of debatable, and it would make sense if they weren't actually trapped in the code, only able to be heard through it. That and the Spamton dialogue, which also references it, but with how strange he is, he could have essentially gotten that in the world of Deltarune from somewhere we may not have even seen yet. However, the main thing I'm curious about is the way they're describing this place and their voice in it. They say they are unheard, but can hear a sound. They clearly do not know about us either, as we clearly can see them look at their words, but they still try and call out. I genuinely do think that in each future chapter, we'll get one step closer to figuring out not only who this person is, though there are many theories for that, but where they are. Maybe the entire point of Deltarune is to find this person, to be with them in the dark. More on Don't Forget later, but genuinely this brings up a good question. What are we even trying to do in Deltarune? Because Ralsei says the point of us being there is to banish the angels' heaven, whatever that may be, but it's strange that neither Susie nor Kris tries to get any more information about what they are doing. They could be getting so caught up in their adventures that they end up in a place they don't want to be in, the place that would essentially end their time in the Dark Worlds. Whether or not Ralsei even knows is also a mystery, but he certainly hasn't told us very much about it. He could have told Kris, though. We see Ralsei talking to them about something while we aren't around, so maybe he's explaining what we're supposed to do. He could also have told Susie about it, but something tells me that even if Susie dragged him off by themselves, he wouldn't. He would have been fine being by himself with Kris, but Susie made the decision to take Ralsei with her in this section. It's pretty obvious Ralsei wasn't expecting that, especially since he seems to have an interest in doing things the way they're supposed to go, like the cutscene in the Snowgirl route and when Susie learns how to do an action by herself. I'm extremely curious to see if this causes a rift between the three heroes, at least Kris and Susie could end up fighting for two different sides. Whose side we'll end up being on is something we can't tell yet, but I really do believe Kris knows more about things than Susie, and Ralsei probably knows even more than Kris. That was a lot of words about a random question I've had for a while, but we're just getting started of course. Let's go ahead and talk about the Spamton Sweepstakes stuff now, as the last thing before I go ahead and make my guesses on the themes and whatnot of future chapters before diving into the existing ones. I think the most interesting thing about the secret pages is the icy sightings. Not only is it extremely strange, but the page it links to is for Des, who as we know is missing. Also, even though this page says Noelle wrote this, the text is absolutely nothing like her usual typing, except for the sheer amount of exclamation points. Honestly, it wouldn't be that insane if it didn't mention all the characters that could have potentially been involved in Des's disappearance. It's also one of two things from the sweepstakes on the actual Deltarune sweepstakes page, the other one being Noelle's blog about a Dragon Blazer's non-ARG. I think that this page was purely to show that there might have been around 26 pages related to the sweepstakes pages, though I'm unsure if that's accurate, but then why even have these at all? My only guess is it's to try to bring attention to the fact that we don't really know about these characters' past yet. We don't know what happened to Des, if any of these stories really occurred, anything. It's also strange that some of these pages seem to only be for certain people, but we can still access them, like the newest scroll page. It says that only friends can see the post, but we can still access it. Also, the banner up at the top is vanished and everything is surrounded in darkness. The banner is still supposed to be there though, as even in Inspect element it shows the ornaments, PNG, and the text. Overall, I don't necessarily think that this will be extremely important to the game, but I do think we'll get some more stuff like this as Deltarune progresses, hinting at future things and past things. There could be something similar for each chapter, or groups of chapters where there's just a ton of pages that loosely link together that tell us a little more about the backstory of the Lightworld characters. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and speculate on release dates. Based on what we've seen so far, I think a solid release date for chapters 3 and 4 is around the middle of 2025. It could be later, and it could likely be earlier, especially with the more recent updates, but I believe this is a pretty good window. The internal deadline for chapter 4 has already been set, so they have a clear goal in mind that could cause them to work a little faster, or it could mean they're decently close enough to be able to predict when they could finish it. Obviously, it's been way longer than a year to complete chapter 3, but they've also worked a little on chapter 4 since then, and we're working on implementing future things for future chapters. I think the majority of the time spent on these two chapters has been adjusting things to better fit the game and pacing and releases, which is probably why a lot of the status updates were pretty repetitive. They also had a few people working on the later chapters during the main development of chapter 3. They were simply working on the game and the smaller aspects to get them just right, but the main bulk of things went by pretty quickly, all things considered. In the summer newsletter of 2023, Toby kind of even says that chapter 3 is a ton of pieces and it was hard to fully visualize until a lot of it was already done, so he would have to adjust a decent amount. That being said, if you like what the team got done in 2023 alone, it's kind of insane. I recently looked back through all those newsletters, and in like a year from the start of 2022 newsletters, where only some of the content for Chapter 3 had been completed, Toby had Chapter 3 fully complete minus the finishing touches. The longer way could be similar to Chapter 4, but I don't think that will be the case, as Toby has stated Chapter 4 would be more of a standard chapter, while Chapter 3 seems like it will have all sorts of never-before-seen mechanics in Deltarune. Also, Toby is always finding ways to speed up development, and it seems like in most newsletters he has something to say about how the speed will be increased for future chapters. If it doesn't come out in 2025, 2026 is guaranteed. As for Chapter 5, I think a release of early 2027 is doable, though depending on the content for it, it could end up taking up to late 2028 if it isn't more of a standard chapter like Chapter 4 will be. I feel like Chapters 6 and 7 could end up releasing at the same time, assuming Chapter 7 is the final chapter. Chapter 7 would be wrapping everything up, so I feel like leaving Chapter 6 on a cliffhanger would just be purely mean. That being said, I predict the future release of Deltarune will come out sometime in 2030, assuming the timing stays relatively the same, which is a very long time away, but something I will gladly wait for. Again, this isn't confirmed or anything, it could end up going way quicker or slower than I expected to, but I think 2030 would be a pretty solid guess. We'll be able to see the closer we get, and yes, I will be posting daily news every single day up until it releases. I guess it's only fitting having to have determination in order to wait on the release of Deltarune. Now let's talk about chapter themes, or where and what each chapter will be. We already can confirm Chapter 3 is a TV world, and I don't think many people disagree with that considering we even have art of one of the sections, but the rest of the chapters we still don't have a solid guess for. I do however believe that in one of them, probably Chapter 7, we will actually end up going back to the school closet since it looks like there's more areas we can explore in it and it's such a strange area. I'll talk more about the beginning of Chapter 1, including the closet in a bit, but let's focus on 4 through 6 for now. My main guess of Chapter 4 is the church. Rudy says that the next day he may be well enough to go to church, and since it's a day off from school, weekend or not, according to Alphys, Kris and Susie would have a reason to be going places other than the school. They may even try and explore other areas on purpose to find more dark worlds since they seem to be having a great time in them. I can perfectly picture them wandering into the church and finding an unused closet somewhere in a random hallway that holds a dark world, and it would also be public enough place where other people could be in the dark world with us. My only other guess for Chapter 4 is the graveyard. Same sort of points as before, except this time the only alive person that would potentially be there is Father Alvin, though there's a chance we would get to meet some of the deceased. I think the church is a much more viable option though. It would fit with the themes of Deltarune a lot more, and I feel like we would gain quite a lot of Kris's backstory. That, and since we can't access the church, it would follow the theme of not being able to explore places where dark worlds occur, except for chapter 3 of course. As for chapter 5, this one is pretty hard to guess without knowing the day of the week. For chapter 4 it didn't matter all that much, but whether or not Kris and Susie have school is pretty important. For the sake of the video, we'll say chapters 5 and 6 could be swapped in location if one of the days they have school. That being said, I think chapter 5 could very well be Asgore's flower shop. It may seem kind of a strange location, but it's very similar to other areas with dark worlds in them, specifically the upstairs. It has something that stores items, it has a bunch of random objects that could become enemies or bosses, things like that. Plus there's a set of doors at the top of the room just begging to be opened that are similar to that of the closet and arcade doors. Again, I think this would dive into Kris's past a lot more, being Asgore's home. Maybe he has some hidden files about what happened with Des when he was still police captain, or something else that we don't know about yet. It would be interesting to see, and it would fit. It also follows the theme of not being able to enter a specific area before the chapter, as this backroom is inaccessible. Plus, it's close enough to the lake that I could see that being used in the chapter as well potentially, maybe at the very start or end. Lastly, chapter 6. I feel like the absolute best possible place for this would be, of course, the bunker. If there's a true lab section of this game, this is it. This is where a lot of the things start coming together, or we learn a lot of information, something really important. Even though we haven't seen the inside, we can certainly make guesses, and it would also be fitting with the closet and the closed-off arcade room in areas we aren't allowed to visit before the chapter. The general mystery around it would make for a good second final chapter, and set up the final chapter perfectly. This is assuming there are 7 chapters, which I think is the most viable thing, but if there are more chapters, some alternate places could be the graveyard I mentioned earlier and Icy's. The hospital also has some potential, even more than Icy's actually, since that could go over Rudy and Noelle's stories. As for secret bosses, there are so many items that could be in the running that I genuinely don't know what to choose from, but I'll do my best. For chapter 3 we have a few: the flowers in the trash, the unused spray under the bathroom sink, the unfinished pie, and the trashed item in Azrael's drawer. I'm curious if the reason chapter 3 took so long is because of the secret boss, especially if it's the item in Azrael's drawer, which changes depending on the save file you're on. It would be incredibly interesting if the secret boss changed depending on the location of the save file, but I really do doubt it. That would be way too much lore for me to handle. Though it would also be one of the coolest things I've ever seen. I think the next unlikely would be the spray under the bathroom sink. As funny as this would be, I don't really see it being a good secret boss unless there's something major we're missing. The bathroom also very well just might not be accessible to us in the new Dark World, and same with the upstairs. It could just be the living room and kitchen that we have access to, and if it is, both the unfinished pie and the trash flowers could be good secret bosses. They both have the story behind them connected to the Dreamers, and neither of them are being used. I can't guarantee that these will be the secret boss, but I think it would be interesting to see based on the concept fights uploaded to YouTube. In chapter 3 though, the upstairs could definitely still be used, as there are some parallels to Kris and Azrael's room to the green room, but we'll have to see. For chapter 4, I think the red horn headband that Kris lost could maybe become a secret boss, especially if it's in the church. It would have gone unused by everyone inside, and it could have easily been shoved into a storage closet or left in some other unused area. It's a lot harder to guess places where you can't access beforehand. Speaking of which, chapter 5 and 6 are almost the exact same way. Chapter 5 has a chance of either using something from the fridge or paper on the ground, but just as easily has a chance of being something behind those double doors. And I think that's way more likely since that's what we've seen so far in the first 2 chapters, so I can't really make a guess unfortunately, except that maybe chapter 5 will have a plant one and chapter 6 some sort of database or computer one. For chapter 7, I feel like the secret boss is going to be the exact same as the main villain, but that's taking shots in the dark. It would be really cool to have extra stuff if you defeated all the secret bosses beforehand, and since it's wrapping everything up, dropping lore bombs in the form of a secret boss feels unlikely, but those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think the secret bosses will be, or if you have another area that's more likely to be a dark world. And with that, we can finally start on chapter 1. Hey, editing Nether here. Turns out while recording I just completely forgot to do the soundtrack section, so I'm gonna speedrun that really quick. Basically, there's all these soundtracks that are capitalized that may or may not be related to Gaster, and I think they'll fit in somehow into a single theme later in the game, like maybe some sort of final boss battle or something. But there's also 2 more soundtracks that are even weirder, W.OGG and D.OGG. I talked about these in my previous theory video a long time ago, but these 2 are very weird soundtracks and each one is from a different chapter. The W is from chapter 1 and the D is from chapter 2. If you've been keeping track, you'll realize this could end up spelling out Gaster's name if there's enough chapters for it, though right now it's kinda hard to tell since there's only 7 listed. I really do think these may end up stacking on top of each other to make something cool, but ultimately won't be an extremely important part of the game. While we're on the topic, if you want even more ramblings about random things that I link back to Gaster, you should go check out that video. But yeah, we can talk about chapter 1 now, sorry about that. Alright, finally getting to the meat of the video. Starting with the very first thing after starting a save file, which is of course the connection. We and Gaster connect to start this crazy adventure by making a vessel, which seems as if it's going to be our own before it ultimately gets discarded, seemingly by someone else. You may see my hesitation saying the vessel is specifically for us because we don't get to use it, however it does get saved in the save file, so where will it come in? Will we actually get to use it later in the game, and Kris will be free, or will someone else take the vessel as their own? Some people may argue that the vessel will not be important, that all it was a way to show the player that their choices don't matter, but clearly they do. In Chapter 2, this is shown extremely clearly through either Recruits or Snowgrave, and while not much, Chapter 1 also has multiple moments where choices do matter, albeit in a very small way. An example is the Jubble fight, where you get a different item depending on how you beat him. So what's to say that vessel creation doesn't matter? It literally gets stored for seemingly later use. I think there are two main possibilities for the vessel, even though there's not really any evidence for either of them. Possibility 1 is later in the game either Kris is able to forcibly remove us from their body permanently, or some other event does it for them. We then require the vessel to continue playing the game and ultimately finish it as the vessel. Possibility 2, which I like more, is we end up in the body of the vessel due to some event and then either fight alongside Kris if we made good decisions and proved ourselves to them, or we fight against them due to the actions we took starting in Chapter 2. That would make for an interesting battle, because who would the weirded out subjects choose to fight with? It's not Kris's voice talking to them telling them to do those things, it's ours. I'm saying subjects plural because I do believe this will continue into later chapters as well, but if not, then maybe something else happens that's very similar. Maybe it's just another weird thing, and not a mass murder. I'll talk more about the weird out in part 2 though, because right now we're still focusing on the vessel. One thing that I didn't think much about after playing through the game the first few times was the fact we gave the vessel a mind and a gift. It's like creating your own character for Undertale, but we don't get to use it. Except I absolutely think this gift will come into play. Think forward to the Thrash machine. When we originally made it, we just kinda designed it how we liked, but then in Chapter 2 it had a mechanical impact on the Queen fight. The attacks you get actually change depending on the head you choose, and same with the rules fight a little earlier in the game, that one also using the shoes as attacks as well. So say it's the same thing with the vessel. You get to use different things depending on how you designed it, but since we gave it a mind, I do wonder if it's currently stuck in some sort of purgatory waiting to be rescued. Not saying that the person stuck in the code is the vessel, but it very well could be, if not something similar. And whether or not we'll enjoy being a vessel, that's going to be for us to find out. Ultimately, I think the vessel is going to be a very important part of the game towards the end and will ultimately dictate a lot of final things in the game. Obligatory Gaster time. I promise this is the only main part with Gaster in it, but I'll still reference him a little in the few sections, just not as nearly as much as this. In the beginning, Gaster can of course talk to us. Even before Chapter 1, he could talk to us. But right when the second person comes in, Gaster just doesn't talk to us directly again. Except for on Twitter before Chapter 2 again, he doesn't talk directly to us. The only other time he shows himself in the game is at Chapter 1 save screen before you beat the game at all, and he only references the save screen, completely ignoring us. So where the hell does he go? It's like he just decided to stop talking to us because someone interrupted him a little bit, but then on Twitter he acted like he didn't. He just thanks us for being patient and asks if we should go again. Gaster's behavior towards us in general is just super strange, and I can't help but feel as if it'll end up changing as the game progresses. I think the only times he'll talk to us directly will indeed be through Twitter, at least until everything becomes dark again, as it was before we started Chapter 1. When he talks to us for the first time, everything is dark, and then we end up in this strange location. But in that segment, we're just making the vessel. Gaster isn't just normally talking to us, he's simply giving us instructions on what to do next. Before the vessel maker, he directly talks to us and asks if we're connected. It seems like this and the Twitter posts are the only times Gaster talks to us normally. So if later in the game everything becomes like it was before the vessel maker, I think Gaster will talk directly to us. You may notice that in many theories this is exactly what happens. The roaring or the banishing the angels heaven or some other event happens, making the world dark and causing Gaster to have his moment talking to us directly. The character that interrupts him, however, also talks directly to us. It's almost like there's 2 or 3 versions of Gaster, kind of like Clover in their 3 heads, where they have all the different characteristics about them. I'm not going to go and make another long Gaster theory video, but I just thought this was super interesting. He talks to us like we know what's going on when we simply don't. I suppose it would make sense if he had done this before with other people though. Maybe not the interrupting part, but the fact he had things laid out like they are sort of could imply he has done this many times. There are a few theories similar to this out there, especially from Jaru, so I recommend watching one of those if you're interested in learning more, but ultimately I think that he very well could have, and that could be why he's so busy and calls these times difficult. Alright, enough getting frustrated with the fictional character for not telling us things though, because now it's time for a game of Guess Who. As in, we're going to try and figure out who the second person that cut Gaster off was. For the sake of this section, we'll say the 3 Gaster personalities I briefly mentioned aren't a thing, and we'll only use the characters we know, including ones only referenced like Des. Speaking of, I think that she's a good candidate for this role. She's clearly missing, but there's a chance that she ended up finding her way to wherever Gaster is, and so therefore can take over, or also just in general has a higher power than most characters. This can technically be confirmed since she's referenced outside the game on different Deltarune pages, though even those say that she's lost, and none of them say that Gaster is lost, which could be evidence that she isn't actually the other person here, and rather an entirely missing person, or the person inside the code. Papyrus is kinda similar. He's referenced, but we never actually see him. All we get inside of the game is the trustling of bones growing further away, which could potentially have some meaning inside the game, but it doesn't seem like it will for this particular part. Toby did say that Papyrus is, quote, busy, which could imply his role for this position, but it would make more sense for him to be the knight in this case. It is interesting how Papyrus hasn't been introduced as a character yet though, and I really am curious to see when or where he will come in, if at all. Another character that has a little bit less mystery about them is Rousey. In my opinion, he's the most probable candidate for the second person here. When I was going over this part of my Gaster's Destiny theory, I said that Rousey more than likely has some sort of secret knowledge that we don't have, especially when it comes to things outside the game itself, such as the player. A good video about this is the one by Dorked. We see him talking to Kris outside of our site, and it very well could be him telling Kris some stuff about the outside of the game. Maybe his whole personality of your choices mattering is a front to what he actually believes or knows is going to happen, and he's telling Kris what is actually happening and what to do. This could be why anything he didn't foresee happening freaks him out, because it's not something he can have pre-planned. His whole goal could be to lead the player down a certain way, and so when that doesn't happen perfectly, he gets nervous. He already seems to want us to be kind to people, which could be the reason he freaks out, but I don't think that's the case, as if you decide to attack in Chapter 1, he doesn't mind. But when the route you're taking is labeled as weird, even in the code itself, suddenly he's a lot more worried. Anyways, I truly do believe Rousey's the most likely candidate, but let's talk about a few more characters just in case. Kris could be an option, because just like Rousey, they seem to have a bit more information about things than we do, but it would also be weird for them to be talking to us in a sort of third-person-esque way, so I doubt that this is the case. It could be Sans, due to the strange properties he seems to possess, but that's just throwing random characters out there. The only other character that would maybe make a hint of sense that I haven't talked about yet is Noelle, just since she also has an air of mystery around her, but unless she becomes an even bigger character later in the game, I can't see that being the case either. Still could be possible though. I mentioned how Kris could be a candidate for the interrupting person because they could potentially have extra information, and I'd like to go into that a little more. A big question I had ever since Chapter 2 came out was, does Kris know what's going on? And I don't mean necessarily inside the game, because it seems like they have more knowledge than we do since they've lived in this universe for so much longer, but whether or not they know about what happened with us and Gaster, or why they're possessed in the first place, is something we can't be entirely sure of. If you skip the Vessel Maker and go straight to Chapter 2, it gives the vessel default answers for every question, which are all one except for the gift, which is mind. Interestingly enough, this sort of does line up for what Kris could potentially pick, though the color picking question could be any of them, so there's a chance this has nothing to do with Kris and is just coincidence. It's also interesting that the game starts with Kris asleep while we're actually making the vessel, and only once we're done does Kris wake up, which could mean this takes place inside Kris's mind. All of that is just speculation though, so do we have actual evidence that Kris knows what's going on? Well, kinda. I mean, they have their own save files before we override them, and they pretty obviously don't like the fact we've taken over their bodies since they keep ripping their soul out at the end of chapters. Or our soul? Kinda hard to tell. But I think the biggest thing is the fact that they don't tell anybody what's going on. I mean, they still can control some of what they do, and if I was in their situation I could get help with it, I would. Unless I had something else motivating me to not tell anyone. So either Kris has a reason that's linked to outside the game, or they have someone inside the game telling them to keep quiet, like Rousey. I mean, Kris easily could have told Rousey what's going on the second we weren't actively watching them, and if they did, there's a chance Rousey told them why they couldn't tell anyone else or why they had to just stick with it. It would also make sense because Rousey is constantly undermining Kris's emotions and doesn't seem to notice them on surface level, but Susie easily does. I don't necessarily want our amazing goat boy to sound like some sort of evil mastermind, but he's sort of doing that by himself. I'm also kinda curious as to whether or not they're going to tell the player something. There could be more to this, but every time they rip their soul out, they throw it around as if to show us that we aren't the ones with the control, they are. The throwing into the birdcage, then pulling out a knife, the shoving of the soul into the drawer, holding the soul in the air as the darkness falls down before putting it back in, it really does scream, I just let you control me, but you don't fully control me. Which I think could lead to something pretty cool down the line. But that's all for the intro of the game. Let's move on to when Kris wakes up. So, when we first are able to control Kris, we're of course inside their room and immediately surrounded by things to check that are brand new to us but completely normal to Kris. While there are some interesting things to explore here, the first thing that caught my attention was actually the mirror outside of Kris's room in the hallway. In Undertale, the mirror was used as a sign of growth and excitement, really showing how determined you were they were able to endure so many things, which is why the dialogue for both mirrors have a very positive tone. In Deltarune though, we're immediately hit with the line, "It's only you." This one seems significantly more ominous and almost demeaning. Now, I did say that in Undertale there were only 2 mirrors, but there's actually another bit of dialogue for the Genocide route specifically, where the entire tone of the game is just as ominous, of which it reads, "It's me," and then the player name. There's also another bit of dialogue if you backtrack a lot in the pacifist ending, where it mentions Frisk's name instead, but we aren't really going to focus on that very much. The Genocide route dialogue seems a lot more ominous, as it essentially completely ignores Frisk, which I think is intentionally to show us that we're the ones doing all the bad things and forcing them to partake. Which is almost exactly what the text seems to be pointing at in Deltarune. It's Only You could be taken as completely ignoring Kris, despite the fact they're their own human with a complete backstory, thoughts, and feelings. It's to show that they are no longer in control, and that we were together for a very long time. Except that's only one potential meaning. If you don't look too deep into it and just take it at complete face value, it seems like Kris just sees themselves as somewhat worthless. Think about it. They're the only human in town, everyone calls them weird or creepy, their parents went through a divorce, and Kris's side of the bedroom doesn't really have anything noteworthy. They don't think that they are worth anything because they haven't been in a situation where they would feel like they matter. But then in chapter 2, the dialogue changes to be, "It's what they call you." Again, this could very well imply that Kris isn't the person in control or doesn't see themselves as a human, but it could also imply that they feel a little better about themselves now that they made friends with Susie. They had just made all sorts of new friends in the Dark World too, went on this awesome adventure, and overall seemed to enjoy it quite a bit. In part 2, I'll dig into this a little more, but that's it for this section for now. Next, I would like to talk about Ocean.ogg and the general theme of water in the Dark Worlds. Most of you probably know that when entering the Dark World in Chapter 1 for the first time, a strange soundtrack plays called Ocean.ogg. However, this isn't the only time water is referenced throughout the game. The most common reference is the Dark Fountains, though there are more obscure ones such as this Jevil dialogue. Honestly, the ocean in general is very strange, especially due to Onion-san and the fact there's all this creepy dialogue here. Plus, Kris is blue, almost like they run out of oxygen when entering the Dark Worlds and drown, which maybe could indicate something a bit deeper about them. The theme of water could also be an indication of the unknown, as the ocean is a notoriously difficult place to explore, which could maybe be a nod to the player since we know so little about these characters. All I'm saying is this theme of water absolutely plays into something greater, as it is far too deliberate to be a coincidence. I think we'll see more water-related things in future chapters, whether just surface-level stuff or things that reach the bottom of the ocean, we'll have to see. A short segment of the video, but an important one nonetheless. Right after we hear Ocean.ogg, we are thrown into the Dark Worlds, and what a strange sight it is. Inside of this beginning area, there's all sorts of weird creatures, some of which are hostile, there's all these weird pillars, and the land itself is extremely creepy. Halfbred Chaos made a great video about this area, and you should go watch that as they go fairly deep into it, but I'll give generally what I believe here as well. Number 1, I absolutely believe that we'll be back here at some point during the later parts of the game, as I mentioned earlier. There seems to be at least one area here that clearly leads to somewhere else, and I think it would make perfect sense for it to be a brand new area for us to explore. Perhaps we will get an ability that allows us to climb or something to get to it, or it might just come from a different area, but it has too much mystery and at least one transition area, and so I think it has a great shot at being an area later in the game. Second, like I said in the beginning of this section, this land is extremely weird. Many people have made this comparison, but I'll make it again. This land looks exactly like what Rowsley describes in the legend he tells. The sky will run black with terror, and the land will crack with fear. Which leads me to my next point. The legend has likely already happened. Well, at least parts of it. We have literally appeared at World's Edge, this area is exactly as described, things like that. But the Earth hasn't drawn its final breath, and the last 2 lines make it even weirder. But recently, another fountain has appeared on the horizon, and with it, the balance of light and dark begins to shift. Huh? The words recently and begins really confuse me. If the legend has already happened, why is so much of it different to what actually is occurring currently? And if it hasn't happened, why are we here? Are we actually the people described in the prophecy if it hasn't happened? Is this the land described in the legend? Or is the legend simply not truthful or completely correct? The legend is simply strange, especially in the Dark World, where Rowsley knows it clear as day and Lancer doesn't seem surprised by what he's hearing, though he could just be ignoring it in favor of capturing and or killing us, but it seems nobody else knows about the legend. Whether or not the Lightworld characters know is questionable though, as the symbol seen throughout the legend could simply be seen as the symbol of the religion that they follow, as both Father Alvin and Rudy mention the angel, which is seemingly used in this religion. However, the fact it's seen in this school is very strange, as it's not just part of the symbol, but the entire thing, while the symbol on the gate in the church is just the top half. So what's the deal with this symbol in the legend? I simply think it's unfinished, and just like in Chapter 2, we will learn more and more about either what occurred or what is supposed to occur in the future. I also think that when we finish the game, the symbol will mean quite a bit, whether to the characters or to us. Speaking about what's already occurred, let's speculate on the past of the Dark World characters specifically. There are a lot of hints that something major occurred at some point before our arrival, but there isn't really a lot to work with, and even less for specific character backstories. For instance, Rousey said that he's been waiting his whole life for us to arrive, but what did that look like? Like, did he have a family or other friends around him, or was it just him the whole time, and for how long? He is a prince, which definitely means he has or at least had parents, so where are they? Another thing that matters in this case is Rousey's age. We don't know his canonical age, and so it's difficult to paint a timeline here of his life. He could be 14 years old, or he could be 400 years old. Of course, he does act around Kris and Susie's age most of the time, though he also seems a little more mature, which makes it even more difficult to tell. If he really is that young, it could mean he's had to watch over a completely empty kingdom for most of his life, as his parents may have disappeared well before our arrival. They may even be in another Dark World like how Queen was in a different one to Lancer, and maybe we'll get to meet them. Though, another potential option that's much more likely is that Rousey didn't have any parents, which would make sense if he has a correlating object in the Light World like the headband or the green crayon. It's just a little strange then that he's called the prince and not the king, though maybe it's due to his age or some other factor preventing him from being king. Of course, in order for the prophecy to be correct, he has to be a prince, so maybe he's just not king on purpose. I do think it would be interesting for him to not have parents, especially because he potentially will meet Toriel in Chapter 3, and I'm sure Toriel will make the comparison of Rousey and Azrael. Fun anagram, by the way. I wonder if it will end up playing a part at all, but I kinda doubt it. Rousey isn't the only character with a weird backstory though. Sham and Jebel clearly had something happen between them, hence why Jebel was locked up. Sham in particular is a pretty big mystery, as it seems like he doesn't really care what we do or what happens since he thinks it's all going to end the same way no matter what. But how does he know these things, or why does he believe them? I really wish there was more to go off of for these two characters in particular, and I'm hoping these next two chapters tell us something about them, or at least something about the past. Of course, the backstories of other characters, especially Spamton, are also very complex, though there are many deep dives into them and any one of them could be correct. I'm not going to try and dissect the past of these characters, but I do think we'll be able to do so in these next chapters, or at least get another major piece of information about them. It's something I'm absolutely going to look forward to in the future. Next, I'd like to talk about how the Dark World characters have fully furnished memories despite the Dark World seemingly being just created. This is especially apparent with King and Queen, as they're the main leaders of their respective Dark Worlds. They already have a full kingdom and control of other Dark World characters, of which they have some past experience with them. Both also talk to the Knight, who gave them information before our arrival. Some other examples include Lancer and the rest of the kingdom, as they don't really like him very much prior to defeating King, Sham and Jebel having some sort of history together as mentioned in the previous section, and Spamton remembering all sorts of crazy things, even about characters we haven't met yet. But how? If the Dark World was just created, how do they have all these experiences? Well, there could be a couple reasons for this. Number one, the Dark World characters have a Light World counterpart in the form of some sort of object. Obviously, Light World characters have interacted with these objects, and so potentially they're going off of those experiences just with a bit of change in perspective. But number two, if it has nothing to do with actual experience, it could be the imagination from everyone entering the Dark World. After all, it would seem like every single Light World character so far has been on track to achieving something they like. Noelle gets magic, Berdly becomes a hero, Susie gets to make friends and also hit people with her axe, and Kris gets to be the leader and potentially break the control we have over them. If what the characters desire is put right into the Dark Worlds, it would make a lot of sense for what we've seen so far. Spamton was a direct comparison with Kris, showing them that they could break their strings, Noelle became strong with her magic, and so on. The only time when this doesn't really work is with Snowgrave, which actually makes a lot of sense. It's called the Weird Route for a reason after all. These characters directly influence the Dark World as well as the Dark World characters with their imagination, which paves the way for the story we're going on. I can't tell exactly how it would work if this is the case, since that would mean the Dark Worlds have a different form before we enter them due to the Lightner's imagination not being inserted into them yet, but it's still fun to think about. If this is true, I'm curious to see how Toriel's desires will affect Chapter 3, as well as any other characters that are introduced Dark World-wise in that chapter. And on top of that, I'm curious to see how the Weird Route will react to it. One thing I haven't really mentioned is just how many theories will be debunked once Chapters 3 and 4 release, and a ton of my theories from this video probably will be, this one included. But until then, let's keep going through the game. Next, I'm going to briefly go over the Knight. Obviously, we cannot say for certain who they are, but we can speculate, and speculate we have. There are so many videos going over the Knight and the potential suspects, and it would take far too long to essentially go over the same things, so I'll mention a few suspects that I have currently. Let's start off with the most controversial one, Kris. A lot of the evidence for them being the Knight comes down to timing. They of course can create dark fountains, but the question is when exactly they would be able to do so. The Chapter 1 fountain is pretty self-explanatory as we weren't there previously, so it really could have been created at any point. The Chapter 2 fountain, however, is a bit of a different story. The main reason this one is so much different is due to Noelle and Birdley, since it seems as if the Dark World was created really close to when they entered the computer lab, or someone created it a little after they entered. They clearly were already studying when it was created, which would be impossible if it was Kris, since the only time they could have made it was overnight. So unless I'm missing something major, it really doesn't feel possible that Kris could have made this one in particular, as whoever did it was likely hiding inside the closet or had just left after creating it when Noelle and Birdley walked in, since the fountain seemed to take a bit of time to be created. My next candidate is Rowsey. I haven't watched too many videos about Rowsey's potential knight role in particular, as I wanted to do my own little bit of research into it. Firstly, I'll address the elephant in the room. Rowsey does not seem like a direct Lightworld character, at least probably not, but being the Prince of Darkness must come with some perks. Plus, we can't fully confirm that Rowsey follows the same rules as other Darkners. He's already there when we come back in Chapter 2, he has healing magic, which we haven't seen from any other character outside of Noelle and kind of Susie, whom Rowsey taught, and he also seems to have a lot of knowledge that nobody else has. It is also very strange the way he shows up in Chapter 2, just randomly appearing behind us despite there being no secondary entrance. He said he hurried over, but how does he do that? The Dark Worlds don't seem to be directly connected, so he must have somehow traveled directly with us, or can somehow hop between Dark Worlds. This is another reason why Rowsey being a Dark World character is very iffy. His motives are unclear, though we don't have a solid motive for really any character to make dark fountains. We have a couple of speculative ones, but those ones all have their counterpoints. Perhaps it's for a reason we haven't even learned about or considered yet. The big counterpoint for both Rowsey and Kris is the fact both Queen and King don't recognize either of them, despite being talked to by the Knight. Of course, they could have been wearing some disguise or something, but their voice would probably be the same, so either somehow one of these two managed to completely mask who they were, or it's someone we haven't even seen yet inside of the Dark Worlds. My third and final candidate, just because it's kinda funny, is Papyrus. But I still do have a bit of evidence for him, mainly his absence. When you interact with Sans in Papyrus' house, you hear bone trestle, and in Chapter 2, its sound is growing even further away and just becomes a trestle. This could be resemblant of Papyrus trying to make everything darker and darker. Sans also cancels us hanging out with Papyrus since for some reason it wouldn't work out, which is also weird and nobody in the game mentions him by name. Also on the Deltarune Steam page, it specifically mentions that Papyrus is busy, and the last tiny bit that fits into this theory is the fact Papyrus could fit into the closet, as it could fit a large person inside. And Papyrus technically does have a motive, as he doesn't have many friends, but making Dark Worlds essentially creates new friends for him. And finally, the last piece of information that could link Papyrus to the Dark Worlds is the eggs. A man gives them to you, and on the dating screen in Undertale it has an egg on it. A lot of this info I found through Half-Word Chaos, and it simply makes a ton of sense to me. But enough about the Knight, as the mystery is guaranteed to be solved by the end of Deltarune, and I'm sure it'll be a very entertaining reveal. I briefly spoke of eggs in that last section, and now I'm going to talk specifically about them. Why are eggs so strange in Deltarune? The first experience we get with an egg is Temmie, when we ask to be her partner in the beginning of Chapter 1. She says she already has a partner, and puts an egg on the table, which counts as a partner. Honestly though, this part isn't that weird. It's mostly just a way to get the player to eventually partner up with Noelle, so the story can continue. However, once we get to the Dark Worlds, that's when things get interesting. The only way we're able to find the eggs in the Dark Worlds is by going back and forth between specific rooms to find the room in between. As far as I know, there isn't anything in the first chapter that directly shows where to find the egg, but in the second chapter there is a drawing talking about the room in between. Then once you finally find the room, there's a tree with the man behind it, who will give you an egg depending on what option you pick, then he will disappear. In Chapter 2, there's even more to it, though it seems like a wink to the player that they managed to find a secret. This is all incredibly spooky to me, as even the music seems a little too chipper for this room. Not to mention the unused dialogue for when you're in a room that is normally inaccessible, where you can make an argument that the room in between is incredibly strange and creepy. I feel like we aren't supposed to be able to get these eggs, and since it's not supposed to happen, I wonder if it will play into the weird ride at all. Anyways, the last three places we get interactions with the eggs are all in the Light World. Firstly, Temmie will have an egg counter if you go to the classroom. This is strange, though since it seems these are Easter eggs, it probably is just to eventually help you collect them all, but that is strange since the description says they're not too important or unimportant. The unimportant part is especially curious, as the eggs don't seem to have much of a use. The second interaction we get is at Sans' shop. You can reverse steal the egg by putting it back, or it will disappear if you interact with a specific area of the shop, which again is incredibly strange. Whether that second part is a bug or not is kind of a mystery, though I feel like it isn't, as Toby hasn't fixed it despite so many people pointing it out. The last interaction is at Asgore's place. We are able to put the egg in the fridge and duplicate it, meaning either the egg or the fridge has some sort of incredible property that we haven't really seen yet. All of this is to say that these eggs absolutely will continue to appear, and I feel like they will play a minor part in the story, or at least a specific part of the game, whether important or unimportant. Next, I'd like to talk about the shadow crystals as well as the glow shards because both are pretty interesting in my opinion, mostly the shadow crystals of course. Firstly, the shadow crystals seem to somehow warp the space around us or give us a view of the other world. This is shown when interacting with the shadow crystal in the dark world or the glass in the light world, as they give you special flavored text for the first time you interact with them. The text when using it in the dark world makes perfect sense, but using it in the light world is extremely interesting. If you're alone when using it, it says, "You thought you saw through your hand," and if you're with Susie, it says, "You thought you saw Susie glaring at you, coldly, but when you move the glass away, you see her looking at you, smiling and making a rude gesture." Not only that, but the text for trying to discard it says it felt very wrong and doesn't let you. So do these crystals let you see into the future, or maybe the past, or alternate dimensions? It's very strange. There's a ton of very good videos that go deeper into the shadow crystals, and any of them could be possible, but the weirdest part about them is that they technically aren't mandatory to get. My only guess for them is they're going to be used for either the chapter 3 or 4 secret boss, since Sham talks about needing a specific item in order to beat them, and perhaps it's created using the shadow crystals. One thing I've noticed about mini items and key items is that they hint at something about the future. The eggs, the shadow crystals, even the items we can't get yet, and this leads me to the glow shards. The whole point of them is apparently just to sell, but this does feel pretty weird to me. The only reason it would be necessary is if there's something in one of the ending chapters that's extremely expensive, because in these early chapters, getting money is really easy. It actually does have another use though, as you can instantly make a rude unsparable by using it against it in battle, which causes it to become enraptured. This makes it disappear. So what's to say it doesn't have a use in a future chapter that isn't selling it, and that's why the game encourages you to hold on to it. The first chapter flavor text tells you the use is unknown, and in chapter 2 it just says its value increases with each chapter, so I don't think it's specific to money. Plus the fact that names are very similar, glow shard and shadow crystal, are exact opposites of each other, I can't help but wonder if both of these will be used together in a future chapter in order to encounter a secret boss, a balance of light and dark, and I think it will be an insane boss since it requires collecting since the very beginning of the game. On to the next topic. Creepy bunker time. This was something that immediately caught my attention the first time I played through Deltarune before I had seen anything about it or gone deep into the fandom. I remember walking down from the dark world only to discover a relatively quiet place except for a strange buzzing sound. I was very intrigued. And now it's even more interesting to me. There are very few explanations for this place, but the main one links right back to Gaster, obviously. I say obviously because the buzzing sound is literally just the Gaster sound, and the overall air of mystery around it also screams Gaster. Whether or not this area will be important is debatable, but I almost guarantee it will be used later for at least some section of the game. I definitely think that if it isn't used for a dark world, it will still relate to them in some way or be important for light world based segments. The fact it's so out of the way, changes the sound entirely, all that kind of stuff, plus the fact Kris apparently knows what happens in there, makes me genuinely believe we'll find out in a later chapter. The real question I have is whether Susie knows what's inside of the bunker too. After all, she didn't bother asking Kris about it, even though she clearly heard Snowy and Monster Kid talking about it. If she doesn't know, then there's no way we don't see the inside of it, because not only will we want to, but so will Susie. This is a really short segment, mostly because of the ridiculous lack of evidence I have, but there are plenty of theories that somewhat correspond with this, like Molly Star's massive series of theory videos. Go check them out, those videos are incredibly well made, and you'll get a lot more theory crafting about this specific topic. Again, a short segment, but unfortunately there's just so little in this topic that I can't really say anything else about it. Nearly done with all of the things in chapter 1 that I find strange, but there's a couple more things that link more to both of the chapters that are introduced in chapter 1. Firstly, Kris ripping their, or our, soul out at the end of chapter 1 and the last section of chapter 2. Obviously this hasn't been confirmed, but I wholeheartedly believe that the soul Kris rips out of their body is 100% ours. There's plenty of evidence for this, like being able to move around in the birdcage and the fact that we stay wherever our soul gets left, but wait, that doesn't actually make any sense unless the way we, as the player, work very differently to how it gets perceived in-game. My main evidence for this is the Susie vs Lancer fight. We as the player are not only able to observe, but actually dodge during this battle. Of course, it could just be for the gameplay, but since this segment is insanely story-filled, I feel like it's entirely viable to be part of the story. Perhaps our soul doesn't actually link with Kris. It would make sense in quite a few ways. First and foremost, Kris can rip out the soul as I mentioned before. How they should be able to just do that if it was their own soul. It is possible to have soulless beings as seen in Undertale, but this world clearly works differently, and we can't even be certain Kris is soulless after ripping out the soul. Cue all the theories involving 2 or even 3 of them inside of Kris. Not only that, but even with the soul inside of them, they can still move by themselves, although they don't do this too often for whatever reason. And Kris was acting weird even right before they ripped the soul out in chapter 1. The fact we were able to follow them as well as other characters could just be how it's supposed to work, or maybe our soul is like a parasite that can infect others, allowing us to be with them as well. Suddenly the whole with you in the dark thing would make a bit more sense. Okay, look, this next part is going to sound kind of crazy, but hear me out. What if Kris accidentally made Susie a puppet on a string, just like them, under us, and their goal is to try and save her after they became friends with her? Think about it, the only person we're able to follow that isn't Kris is Susie, except for kind of 2 other people, but I'll talk about that in just a second. On top of that, Susie can hear us, or at least become influenced by us in some way, as we're able to give dialogue options to her. It also only happens when Rousey is explaining something to Kris, and I wonder if it has anything to do with them asking for help. The conversation doesn't start until after we leave because Kris doesn't want us to figure out their plan, and I wonder if they both are also trying to keep Susie in the dark. If Susie finds out, how will she react? Will she forgive Kris on the spot or try and fight them? It makes me nervous about the future of these two. Of course, it could be something different than infecting her with a puppet master, but my points still stand. I feel like this is the reason we're seeing so much growth from Susie and very little from Kris or even Rousey. I feel like this is the reason Kris wants more Dark Worlds, and I feel like this is the reason why being in the dark is such a theme, since it means not being in the know. Spamton affected Kris a ton, and it could be their guilty conscience talking. Spamton says that he's still in the dark, and Kris panics because despite his efforts, Spamton still didn't make it to the light. And I think the foreshadowing when he says, "You 3 can break your own strings," absolutely will apply to Susie, and if the infecting happens to Rousey, it would also make sense. Except, I think it actually only infects Lightners. For one scene in chapter 2, we're able to follow Noelle and Birdley. Susie's in there, and neither is Kris, and yet, while Susie is falling, we get to watch them. Noelle in particular is very interesting to me, and I'm sure you know why by now. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from here. Just keep this theory in mind. It's also interesting to me that Kris rips the soul out twice in chapter 2, and I think the only reason they rip their soul out at all is for complete freedom for a few moments as they continue executing their plan. The only problem with this is the fact they're able to move just fine without a soul. Either that or Kris actually does have multiple souls, but wouldn't that make them become insanely powerful? If it works anything like in Undertale, Kris should in theory be the most powerful out of everyone by far. I think this is absolutely the case, but in a different way to Undertale. The fact we're able to control them is already a massive step up, as we the player are essentially a god. On top of that, Kris is the only one with the power to save. Saving, especially in Undertale, was a sign of power, as Flowey used to be able to do it and we were able to do it through sheer determination. I hope we get some sort of resolution about Kris and their soul, but for now I'll move on to the final segment. The final thing I'd like to cover is the theme of Deltarune. And no, I don't mean story-based themes, I mean the song Don't Forget. Its motifs are absolutely everywhere, and the lyrics have been analyzed 1,000 times over. However, this track is not called Deltarune. In Undertale, the track Undertale is the technical main theme. It contains a ton of the main motifs, it's emotional, well-designed, long, and overall perfectly encapsulates a main theme. Over 6 minutes of nothing but pure nostalgia looking back on it now. But don't forget, less than a minute and only contains the one main motif. The only thing it has going for it is the emotion. It's somewhat hopeful, but mostly sad. Undertale's was pure hope, and of course the main difference, Undertale the track has the same name as the game. I think there will be a true final theme for Deltarune. It will be quite different from Don't Forget, but will still include parts of it, if not more lyrics. I think it is simply a segment of the final theme, just as many of Undertale's songs are essentially segments of the main theme there. And I can't wait to be blinded by nostalgia years after I've finished Deltarune by that very song. As for Don't Forget, the mystery around it is truly incredible. I won't be going into the lyrics, but I think you should analyze them for yourself. Think about what they might mean, who sings them, all that stuff, and then think about the music itself. Then think about Undertale's music and how that influenced the game, and generally what the motifs were meant to represent. I hope you'll agree with me that it is quite different, but that it will eventually all come together. Well, that's going to be it for part 1. Thanks for listening to my ramblings. I've essentially been thinking about Deltarune for the past 500 days straight and wanted to get at least most of my thoughts on the future of Deltarune down before the next chapter is released and we have another 3 years worth of theories to make. Part 2 will probably be very similar to this video, but after that, most of the theories I make will be much more in-depth and probably only on those future chapters. But yeah, that's it for me. Go take a break if you need to. I certainly will after writing, recording, and editing this. Speaking of, sorry if anything in this video was confusing, or if you couldn't understand what I was trying to say. I was trying to get this out by day 500 after not being able to work on it for a while, so I kind of had to speedrun a lot of the process, and I wasn't able to get everything perfect. If you made it this far, consider subscribing and join us in our way for the future of Deltarune. Stay determined for that, and for part 2 of this longer video. I'll have a ton of stuff I'll be talking about in that one too. I don't make things like this very often, but I have quite a bit of fun with it when I do. Also, if you want updates on videos like this, and want to know right away if something happens with Deltarune, join the Discord, link in the description. If you have any questions or thoughts, put them down in the comments and I'll try and read as many as I can. Oh, and lastly, if you like this type of content, consider watching my first theory video on this channel too. All that being said, thank you so much for watching, and thank you for sticking with me for 500 days on this channel. See you next time, and bye bye.